Missouri State Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick joined us on a very special edition of Millsap in the Morning. The auditor took office in 2023 after serving a term as the state treasurer. He spent several years in the state legislature as a representative. His last 2 years, he was the chairman of the House Budget Committee, and he joins us here on Millsap in the Morning. And Mr. Auditor, we appreciate you taking your time with us. You issued a very strong report to the governor's office on June 10th, and really prior to that, issued a warning to the state legislature about a possible budget crisis. In fact, in the report on June 10th, you classified it that Missouri's budget is broken. Tell us about that.
Sure. So we have, over the last 5 years, due to COVID and a lot of other factors, revenue has grown significantly in the state, but also so has state spending. And unfortunately, spending has grown a little bit faster than revenue. And what that means is over the last 5 years, state spending from the general revenue fund has grown by over 50%. I think it's about 52%. And during that same period of time, inflation's up only about 25%. So obviously, when you have government growing twice as fast as inflation, that is not a sustainable trajectory, and it's not something that should continue on into perpetuity. And also, because expenditures have grown faster than revenue, we're spending at a deficit. And what that essentially means is we had money in the bank. We built up a fund balance through the COVID years where we had a lot of extra revenue. And there was a lot of extra federal money coming in that let the state pull money out of things that it typically funds and put federal money in the place of it. Well, now that the federal money is kind of going away, the state has to pick the tab back up for a lot of these things. And what that means is that we have a deficit. And so we had a high water mark of about $5.8 billion in the state's general revenue fund a few years ago. And the fiscal year that will end next June 30th, we're projecting to have about $600 million left in the bank, while spending about $1.7 billion more than we're going to collect this coming year. So obviously, if you have a $1.7 billion deficit and a $600 million fund balance, you can't do that again, and you'll run out of money 4 months into your fiscal year if you do that. So what we've said is, hey, there's going to have to be serious spending cuts that need to take place. The sooner that we begin that process, the less painful it will be. And also, the sooner we start, the longer our fund balance will last us. And so we're just letting people know that, hey, that we've had a lot of good years of state revenue increasing, but we're now kind of getting back to reality, and the governor is going to have his work cut out for him to balance the state's budget. He inherited this situation. The budget was not balanced. We had a fund balance and we were spending from it when he took office. And so he's unfortunately the person in the chair that has to kind of right the ship and, just letting people know that's what's going to need to happen. And I'm encouraging him, obviously, to begin that process sooner rather than later.
And Missouri's in a unique position because constitutionally you have to have a balanced budget. So as he looks at the budget in the coming month and making those decisions, in the end, he has the ability to make some line item vetoes, change some spending recommendations made by the legislature. So I would assume that, and he agrees with you, that there is an issue and a problem that has to be addressed immediately.
Yeah, Missouri, a lot of people say, I think there's a conception, maybe a little bit of a misconception, we have to have a balanced budget, but we don't. We just have to make sure we don't run out of money in the fund. So we cannot deficit spend below zero in our bank account. And so for a very long time, that meant basically just in practice that we had a balanced budget. We had to have a balanced budget because we didn't have a big fund balance. But when we got to the point where we had a lot of money in the bank, we actually were able to have budgets that weren't actually balanced because we had money in the bank to take up the shortfall. But as that fund balance goes away, we are getting back to, for all practical purposes, needing to have a balanced budget, because you're right, we cannot borrow money essentially for ongoing expenses of the government. We are not Washington, D.C. We can't just go out and sell debt to the Federal Reserve and other compulsory buyers of our debt and then use that and not really have to pay it back. So we are in a situation where the governor does have, fortunately, he has line item veto authority. He also has the constitutional authority to withhold money from the budget without vetoing it, so he can leave the appropriations intact but not fund them if the money is not there. So there's a lot of power vested in the governor and the Constitution of the state of Missouri to allow him to take extraordinary measures to balance the budget. But the sooner those measures are taken, the less severe they will need to be.
One of the issues that's on the ballot, and I want to spend some time on that and visit with you about that, is on August 4th, voters in Missouri will go to the polls and make a decision on Amendment 5, which would eventually phase out the state income tax. And I find it interesting that in a state where the Republicans hold the supermajority in the General Assembly, they hold all the state executive offices. And for most of rural Missouri, at least where we live in Laclede County, they hold all the offices at the courthouse, that there is some issue or some discussion about cutting taxes, which you wouldn't think would be there, and Amendment 5 that would do away with Missouri income tax eventually. Do you find it interesting that we're talking about cutting taxes yet, but there's a lot of pushback, and if not pushback, at least it seems to be treading water among a lot of voters?
I'm not surprised because a few things. Number one, as I detailed in the General Revenue Fund report that we just talked about, we have a spending problem. Revenue is up, very significantly. We've cut taxes from the state income tax was 6% 10 years ago. It's now 4.7%. So we've cut the income tax by almost a quarter in terms of the total percentage of that. And we've grown revenue while we've done it. So we've been very responsible in the way we've cut taxes so far. Revenue's up 43% over the last 5 years. That's almost double inflation. So we don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. When you're spending 53% more over 5 years as a governmental entity, that is a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. And so what we're talking about with Amendment 5, I view it as really, to me, it's more of tax reform. And there'll be likely some tax cut component to it. But for the reality is it's more of a tax reform proposal because the legislature could go in tomorrow and eliminate the state income tax. The problem is right now, the state income tax makes up almost 70% of our revenue. And if you go eliminate 70% of your revenue, you have a major problem financially as a state. And what the state legislature cannot do right now is they cannot change the way the sales tax is levied. So Missouri is a state that only taxes, for the most part, goods. And goods are a declining share of consumer spending in the American economy. We, right now, spending on consumer spending, about 30% of that spending is on goods and 70% of it is on services. Most states, pretty much all the states around us, I believe all the states around us, tax services at some level. We don't do any of that. And also, people talk about the sales tax being a regressive tax. Well, the things that the lowest income Missourians spend their money on are the things that we're taxing right now. Goods are the things durable goods, those are the things that low income people spend most of their money on. The services that we don't currently subject to a sales tax are the things that higher income individuals spend more of their discretionary earnings on. And so it is less of a regressive tax. And also the Missouri income tax itself it's not like the federal income tax. It's not a progressive tax system where before you pay the top rate, you're making hundreds of thousands of dollars. In Missouri, you're paying the highest rate at $9,000 of income. So anybody who has any earned income, even if you take the standard deduction, which is around $12,000 or $13,000, any single filer who's making more than say $22,000 or $21,000 in a year is going to pay income tax in Missouri. And we have a $15 an hour minimum wage. So if you're working a full-time job at minimum wage, you're making $30,000 a year. So every Missourian who works a full-time job is paying some income tax. And what we're talking about is getting rid of that and expanding the base on which the sales tax is collected. What that will do is a few things. Number one, every state that's crushing it economically doesn't have income tax. The top three that are blowing the doors off are Texas, Florida, and Tennessee. Tennessee being the one that's most comparable directly to Missouri. It borders us. It's an inland state. It doesn't have the coastal aspect to it. And it's doing very, very well. Not every state with an income tax or without an income tax is doing incredibly well. I think it's one of the very important things economically for a state is to have good tax policy along with strong public safety, a good regulatory environment, a strong workforce, but it's certainly an important component of economic development. And what we're talking about doing is eliminating an income tax so that people don't have to pay that and essentially replacing it with a broader, wider dispersed sales tax that will wrap in services and things of that nature. And by doing that, you can keep the overall sales tax rate relatively low. You don't have to go to a 20% sales tax if you can expand the base. And I know I've seen ads saying 20% sales tax. That's absolutely false. That's not what would happen. But the reason to do this, people ask why. It's because Missouri is falling behind. When I got to the legislature in 2013, if you looked at any economic statistic, Missouri was about 2% of it. We were basically 1/50th of most national statistics. You could figure out that was basically Missouri's share of it. Fast forward to today, that is no longer the case. We are behind. We're less than 2% of everything. And what that means is that Missouri is growing slower than the rest of the country is. The rest of the country is growing faster than Missouri. And we have a choice to make as a state that either we can accept the status quo that Missouri is going to be left behind and that the rest of the country is going to grow faster than us and we're going to be an afterthought, or we can do something about it. And we're not the only state. There's a lot of other states that are looking at getting rid of their income tax. We can do something about it, change our tax structure to be more of a consumption-based tax state instead of an income tax state, which is a tax on your production, and put ourselves in conversations with states like Tennessee that are right now just frankly kicking our butt economically so that we can have more growth. And what more growth does is, I believe a rising tide lifts all ships. You have more investment in the state of Missouri, that's going to create more jobs. When you have more jobs, that creates more competition for labor. When you have more competition for labor, people's wages go up. And when people's wages go up, they have more discretionary money to spend. They spend that money back into the economy, and it results in increased tax revenues to state and local governments. So that's the argument for doing it. That's why I support it. And I hope it helps a little bit to have a little bit of an explanation about it.
Well, I think it does. And one of the things that in talking about personal income tax, and Missourians will pay anywhere from 2% to 4.7%, I think, depending where you fall in the income bracket when you talk about state income tax. But there's also a flat income tax for corporations. That would do away with the flat tax for corporations that would want to move into Missouri, correct?
No, so the corporate income tax on C corporations would remain in place at this time. So what we're talking about right now would be the individual income tax, which would, get rid of the income tax for citizens, and it would get rid of the income tax for businesses that are primarily small businesses that are that file their taxes as a pass-through entity, essentially. So if you have an LLC, most LLCs are pass-through entities, meaning the income of the LLC passes through to the personal income tax return of the people who own it. And so that's predominantly small businesses. So the large corporations that are C Corps, that are publicly traded companies, the corporate income tax at this point in time would remain in place. It's the personal income tax that's paid by the everyday Missourians and the small businesses of the state that we're talking about eliminating.
One of the things that I hear often is, are you robbing Peter to pay Paul by eliminating the income tax but having an increase in sales tax?
Well, it's a shift in the way that we fund services. And the way I look at it is, no, it's not, you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Predominantly everybody in the state that works pays an income tax. So if you're working a job, you're paying an income tax. If you don't work, if you don't have any earned income, then there's a chance you're not paying the income tax. But if you have other income, even if it's unearned income, if it's enough, you're paying the income tax. So, and everybody pays a sales tax. So we're talking about two tax types that pretty much everybody pays something on. And we're saying, what is the less damaging tax? I look at taxes as a necessary evil, okay? You have to have some state-funded services. You have to have public education. You have to have roads and bridges. You have to have things that the government, people expect the government to provide. Now, what the question then becomes, what's the least damaging way to fund those things? What's the least economically burdensome way to fund those things? And the answer is, I think all the research shows that a sales tax is less economically damaging than an income tax. And we're talking about shifting how people pay their taxes. Will there be some people that around the edges maybe pay a little more and some people that pay a little less initially? Yes. In fact, I own a business that currently the labor in that business is not subject to the sales tax. Okay, that will likely become subject to sales tax. It will likely mean that my business will have to charge sales tax on a lot more of its revenue that it currently doesn't charge sales tax on. And so for me, for my business might not be the perfect solution, but I think it's the right thing for the state as a whole. And that's why because I'm for what I think is going to be the best for the state as a whole long term. And I think that over the long term, it probably will be good for my business, and it will probably be good for everybody else's business and the people that work in those businesses when you have more investment in your state. Because I own a Missouri-based boat dock manufacturing company. Okay, I do more business on average, across multiple years. I do more business in Texas and in Tennessee than I do in Missouri. Okay, those are two states that don't have an income tax, and just my business is an anecdote. I have more revenue coming from these states that I'm not even based in than I do in my home state. And the two states that I'm talking about are the two states that don't have an income tax that are nearest to us. So that gives you an idea of, and those states both you're charging way more sales tax on the product than you are here. So it's we have the 12th lowest state sales tax in the country. And here's the other thing that I think people miss is when you expand the base, the things that you're collecting a sales tax on, what that does, the state would use that money to pay for eliminating the income tax, eliminating an entire kind of tax that we currently pay. Okay. What local governments will do, because they don't have an income tax unless you're the city of St. Louis or the city of Kansas City, every other local government is funded with sales taxes and property taxes. So if you expand the base of things that you're collecting a sales tax on, what that's going to do to these local governments is it's going to be a huge increase in the amount of money they're collecting. Now, in order to prevent that, we don't want local governments to be collecting 2 to 3 times the revenue they're collecting today, because they don't need that. They don't need to have that additional revenue. What the amendment does is it would require those local governments to roll back either their sales tax rate, or they can choose to roll back their property tax or real property tax rates to offset the windfall that they would get from the broadened base. And so what that means is in any political subdivision of the state, city, county, whatever, that has a sales tax and a property tax, that county will either have to roll back their sales tax rate, or they'll have to roll back their local property taxes. And so in a lot of these places, what that will mean is that people are going to get a reduction in their property tax bill in addition to getting rid of the income tax. And I think that's a huge win as well, because people absolutely hate property taxes. I don't like property taxes. It's insane to me that we have a system where you buy a home or you buy a car, you can pay for it in cash, and yet you still have to make a payment to the government every year for the privilege of owning an asset. And so if we can get rid of the income tax and also as a byproduct of that, have reductions to the property tax, I think that's a win-win.
One of the things in Laclede County or in the city of Lebanon, I think the total sales tax is a little over 8%, 8.41%, I believe. Also, within that tax or in the taxes of, you may have a law enforcement sales tax of 0.25%. Will that eliminate, or not eliminate, but hamper local governments that want to have a sales tax and they up it from, let's say, a quarter to a half a cent? Is that going to be an issue under this proposal?
No, in fact, what it'll do is it'll make it to where those sales taxes won't have to be as large of a percentage. So if you have let's just say for argument's sake that we're currently collecting tax on probably 25% of consumer spending. I mean, we have 30% of spending as goods, and there's some exemptions to goods in the sales tax code. Let's just say we levy a sales tax on about half of the services spending that's out there. Well, what that does is that probably doubles your sales tax revenue at the same. So if you have a 0.25% sales tax, law enforcement sales tax, that's raising $1 million for your sheriff's department, and you double the amount of tax that a 0.25% generates, you can cut the tax rate in half and collect the same amount of money. So instead of needing a 0.25% to raise that $1 million, you'd only need 1/8%. And so what it does is And the reason is because you're collecting tax on transactions you're not currently collecting it on. But by doing that, you can manage a way to lower the rate. And in some cases, I mean, the state rate would have to go up a little bit, but the local rates are going to go down. And so really overall, as a combined state and local sales tax rate, you're probably going to be looking at maybe a slight increase to the state sales tax rate, but it's not going to be an outlandish increase if there is one. And there's some areas of the state where the local component of the sales tax is so high. I think Columbia, Kansas City, some of these bigger cities that have a lot more sales taxes layered on top of each other, where actually the state and local combined rate might actually be lower than it is today when you expand the base or broaden the base of the sales tax. And so so to answer your question, no, I don't think it hampers that in any way. And if anything, it makes it less damaging because the rate itself wouldn't have to be as high to generate the same amount of money.
Of course, right now, nobody knows what the guardrails will totally be on this piece if it would pass in August, because it goes back to the state legislature to kind of figure all that out. In the state of Tennessee, and you brought that up, I think their sales tax is around 7%, but they have a cap on a grocery tax of like 4%. Could you see Missouri going that direction? Because that seems to be one of the issues that I hear a lot of, is that you're going to see this huge increase in your ability to go to the store and buy groceries.
Yeah, I think goods that are imperative for people to survive, would get probably special consideration in that. I believe that we can keep our sales tax rate roughly in the 7% range, the state sales tax rate. We're currently at 4.225. I think you probably have to go up to about 7% to do this, but which is it's like the same as Tennessee. But that would make sure that you don't levy a tax on healthcare, on agriculture, and on real estate, which is the things the governor has specifically said he's not in favor of putting a sales tax on. I think you can also continue to have some caps on grocery sales taxes and things of that nature as well, so that you're not things that are currently in public policy that already have special treatment granted to them, like groceries, because we do have a special exemption on certain types of groceries. Leaving some of those types of things in place, I think, is doable, and it probably marginally affects the total rate you have to charge. But I do think it's something that would be discussed legislatively. And so what the people are voting on here is you want to allow the legislature to pass a bill. And the reason that it needs to be voted on is because about 10 years ago, there was a constitutional amendment put on the ballot by one interest group that prevented the legislature from levying a sales tax on anything that doesn't currently have a sales tax on it. And so that's a very restrictive thing that doesn't exist in really any other state. And it was adopted, like I said, about 10 years ago. And so that change of the Constitution in and of itself is why this amendment would be necessary for the legislature to go in and do the income tax elimination. Because like I said, they could do it right now. They could eliminate it. But what they would have to do if they did that is, obviously, you'd have to do without 70% of your revenue, or you'd have to take the sales tax rate and go way higher with the sales tax rate on the current things that we levy a sales tax on, without the ability to expand the base on the sales tax that would need to be done to really make it a palatable change, in my opinion, from away from the income tax towards a broadened sales tax.
And I want to go back to what you said, something in the beginning that I think voters need to understand, is that the vote here to send it back to the legislature for the possibility of gradually eliminating a income tax does not replace the fact that the Missouri government is going to at some point have to look at cutting expenses.
No, that's happening now, one way or the other. It's going to have to happen immediately. So you can vote however you want to vote on Amendment 5, but it's not going to change the fact that I view the two things as very separate. The state budget needs attention with or without Amendment 5 passing. I don't believe that Amendment 5 is going to exacerbate that. I think that the bill that would be passed would be responsible. We have a history in Missouri of doing responsible tax cutting, and I believe that history has proven sufficient. We also have seen our neighbor to the west, Kansas, that cut taxes in a way that wasn't very responsible, and they ended up having to go back and undo it. So we've heeded the warning from what happened across the state line in Kansas about a decade ago, and we are not going to make the same mistake that Kansas did. But I do think that the legislature, in order to position Missouri to be competitive economically, to be a destination for growth, the legislature does need the authority to do some things to make that possible. And Amendment 5 is what would allow that.
I know sometimes we make things more complicated than what it needs to be, and Amendment 5 has, it seems like you have to get in the weeds a little bit to kind of look at it. If you had to drill it down to tell a Missouri voter at a coffee shop why this is good for Missouri, tell me what that would sound like.
Well, what I would tell them is that Missouri's falling behind. I've seen it. We used to be 2% of national statistics, national economic statistics. Now we're less than that, which means that the rest of the country is growing faster than Missouri. In order to put ourselves in a competitive position to attract more growth to the state, increase job opportunities, rise wages or increase wages for Missourians, and create a more robust economy, we need to be a state that's competing against the Tennessees and the Texases of the world or of the country. And the only way to really do that, or at least start doing that, is to look at eliminating the income tax. That's what Amendment 5 would make possible. And without Amendment 5, we're going to be stuck with the status quo. And if what we want to do is be a slow growth state that's an afterthought, then vote no on Amendment 5. If we want to be a state that has an opportunity to transform ourselves economically and position ourselves for the future, then vote yes. And really what it comes down to is a lot of people, it's like, hey, I know that it's not fun to pay sales tax on your haircut, but if that's more important to you than having a state that's going to be positioned for success and long-term future, then, that's a decision you have to make. But for me, I'd rather pay the sales tax on my haircut and be in a state that's growing strongly and it's providing more opportunity for our kids and our grandkids, and where there's going to be jobs created and there's going to be more investment. And also, you get the benefit of not paying the income tax, which if you work a job, you're paying the income tax. And that, to me, is a big benefit.
Missouri State Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick, thank you for joining us on Lebanon Now.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.